Yang Xiang wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be the one fixing this. After all, he was just a middle-tier electrical engineer working at one of Shanghai's largest power plants. Not a hero. Not someone destined for great things. Just a guy who spent too many late nights watching screens flicker in the quiet hum of the plant. But today was different. IT started like any other Tuesday, mundane and predictable. The noise of the plant was deafening, a mechanical buzz that seemed to vibrate in every bone. The engineers, including Yang Xiang, sat at their terminals, eyes glued to data streams and voltage meters. Nothing out of the ordinary. Until the blackout hit. A single moment, that jarring moment when the world shifts beneath your feet, made Yang Xiang's day feel entirely different. One moment, his computer was alive with numbers and graphs, and the next, everything went dark. The hum of the plant, everything, stopped. Great, another outage, muttered Li Jun, the engineer at the desk next to Yang Xiang, his voice tinged with the usual annoyance. Yang Xiang didn't move. He sat there, staring at the blank screen in front of him. As far as he could tell, the outage wasn't just a local glitch. It was something larger. The entire power grid in the area had collapsed. Do we have any idea what's causing it? Yang Xiang asked, his voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. Li Jun shrugged and pushed his chair back, standing up. We'll have to check the transformer unit. That's usually where the issues start. Yang Xiang watched as his colleague walked away. But his mind was elsewhere, on the blackout. He knew this plant, inside and out. He understood how every piece of machinery, every wire, and every transformer worked. This didn't feel like just another outage. Something about it was different. He closed his eyes, letting his senses sharpen. It wasn't just the lights. The entire system was dead. That wasn't right. In a place like this, the grid shouldn't fail this completely. I could fix it, Yang Xiang thought, though that was a strange thought for him to have. It was absurd. He was an engineer, not an electrician, yet there was something in him that called out to the current, like an instinct he had never recognized before. What if I could do more than just fix it? What if I could actually control it? His fingers twitched. His body felt light, almost weightless. With a deliberate thought, he reached out to the grid, letting his mind drift across the cables and through the transformers. He imagined the flow of electricity, the pulse of energy running through the veins of the city. He felt the hum of the current, like a hidden song, hidden in the walls of this industrial monstrosity, and then, something clicked. The lights flickered back on. Yang Xiang opened his eyes. He was sitting in the same chair, but the room around him had changed. The systems hummed back to life. He could hear the machines whispering, as if they were alive, responding to his thoughts. The entire grid had come back online, almost as if he'd called it back from the brink. Li Jun returned to the room, his eyes wide in surprise. What the? He stopped in his tracks. Did you fix it already? Yang Xiang stood, pretending to be just as surprised as his colleague. Yeah. Looks like it's all back online. I guess I just had a moment of insight. Insight, huh? Li Jun said, narrowing his eyes. Well, that's impressive. But how did you? Before he could finish his sentence, Yang Xiang's mind wandered, like a curious child at play. A faint thought flickered in his head, and suddenly the lights in the room blinked off again. They flashed back on a second later. Li Jun jumped back. What the hell? Yang Xiang grinned sheepishly. Sorry, just wanted to make sure it was working. But deep down, Yang Xiang knew something had changed inside him. It wasn't just about fixing electrical problems anymore. It was something bigger, something far more complicated. His fingers tingled with electricity. He had touched the grid, become a part of it somehow. And if he could control it here, what else could he do? It wasn't until later that night, after Yang Xiang had left the plant, that he realized the full extent of what he had done. The streets outside were empty, and the city lights flickered around him. He walked home slowly, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. I can't be the only one who knows this, he thought, uneasy. He reached his apartment and opened the door. The familiar hum of electricity met him as soon as he stepped inside. He turned the light on, and it flared bright for a moment before dimming to a steady glow. He could feel it. The pulse. The current. It was all around him now. It wasn't just in the walls anymore, it was in him. And somehow, he had tapped into it. He dropped his bag and walked to his desk. His computer was on, the screen showing a blank file. He stared at the keyboard, fingers twitching. He didn't need to press a key. The computer knew he was there. It responded to his thoughts. The cursor moved across the screen, blinking in anticipation. He smiled. It was working, but then, without warning, the screen flashed and glitched. The cursor jumped erratically. Yang Xiang froze. His heart raced. What just happened? He didn't have time to think. A message appeared on the screen, black text against a bright white background. We know what you can do. Yang Xiang's blood turned cold. He scrambled to close the laptop, but it wouldn't budge. The words on the screen multiplied, repeating, "We know what you can do." "Who is this?" Yang Xiang demanded, his voice shaking. The reply came almost instantly, "You're not the first. But you're the most interesting." Yang Xiang could feel his pulse racing in his throat. He slammed the laptop shut, breathing heavily. Who's trying to control me? It wasn't just a prank. This was something different. Something far more dangerous. And then, the lights in his apartment started flickering again. The refrigerator hummed unnaturally loud. His phone buzzed with a notification, a message from an anonymous account. "We're watching. You're not safe." That night, Yang Xiang lay awake, staring at the ceiling. What had happened to him? How had he gained this power? And who was watching him? His thoughts were interrupted by another message, this one coming through his phone. The screen read, "You've been marked. You're one of us now." Yang Xiang's phone buzzed again, the vibration sharp against the silence of his apartment. He didn't want to check it. He didn't want to admit that this was happening, that somehow, in the quiet of the night, he had become the center of a game he didn't understand. But he couldn't resist. He swiped his finger across the screen. The message was there again. "You're not safe." This wasn't some prank. Whoever these people were, these hackers, they knew about him. They knew what he could do. He had to make sense of it, had to find out why they were targeting him. But the deeper he delved into the mystery, the more dangerous it seemed. Yang Xiang's mind raced. He was no longer just an engineer, he was something else, something that could control the flow of electricity, hack into devices, slip through the digital cracks like a ghost. But power like this came with consequences. He knew that. He wasn't naive enough to think it was a blessing. It was a weapon. And weapons had a way of drawing attention. He stood up abruptly, pacing across the room. Every flicker of the lights felt like an omen, every hum of the refrigerator seemed like a reminder that he wasn't in control anymore. He was just a man in a world of circuits and codes, and something was pulling at him from the other side. There was only one thing left to do. He had to find out who was behind these messages, who had marked him. He needed to understand what was at stake. And so, without thinking too much, without worrying about the consequences, Yang Xiang reached out once more. He thought of the current, of the magnetic waves and the pulse of the city's infrastructure, and he willed himself into the digital world. This time, he wasn't just playing with the lights. He was inside the network. The city itself was laid out in front of him, a map of ones and zeros, of data packets flowing like rivers. He could feel the currents beneath him, running through wires and cables, coursing through computers, smartphones, even the very air itself. And then, someone, responded. A line of code appeared in front of him, like a message on a digital screen. You're going to wish you hadn't done that. Yang Xiang's heart skipped a beat, but his determination hardened. He wasn't scared anymore. In this strange new reality, he was the one who held the power. Not them. Not the faceless hackers who had been watching him. He was the one who could navigate the currents of the digital world. I'm not afraid of you, Yang Xiang typed into the void, even though he had no idea who he was speaking to. I'm in control now. The response was immediate. The code on the screen shifted, restructured, almost as if it were alive. You think you're in control? You're just a tool. A tool for a bigger game. Yang Xiang froze. A tool? What did that mean? Before he could process the words, the room around him suddenly went dark. His laptop blinked out of existence, and the hum of the electricity seemed to die away. His heartbeat quickened, but the silence didn't last long. The lights flickered back on, and with them, a new message appeared across his computer screen, the words flashing almost faster than he could read. The black circuit is coming for you. Yang Xiang's breath caught in his throat. The black circuit. That name, he had heard it whispered among the higher-ups in the power industry. A legend. A group of hackers so elusive, so dangerous, that even the government was afraid of them. But what did they want with him? What did they see in him that was worth targeting? His mind raced. He tried to focus, to bring the chaos under control, but it was impossible. He could feel the pressure building, like a dam on the verge of bursting. He was caught between two worlds, the tangible world of wires and machinery, and the intangible world of data and codes. What do you want from me? He typed into the screen. The words appeared before him in bold, unforgiving letters. Tell me what you want. The reply came swiftly. You have something we need. The ability to control the grid. To control everything. The question is, do you want to keep it? Yang Xiang felt a surge of anger and confusion. They wanted his power. The power he had accidentally unlocked that night, the power to control the electric currents, to manipulate the very infrastructure of the world. But he couldn't let them have it. Not without understanding why they wanted it so badly. A new message blinked onto the screen. You can't run. You can't hide. We are already inside. His heart pounded in his chest. Inside? What did that mean? Before he could react, a new series of flashing messages filled his screen, as though someone was playing with his computer from the other side, controlling it with an almost demonic precision. It took Yang Xiang a moment to realize what was happening. They weren't just hacking into his laptop. They were using him, his very connection to the electrical grid, as a gateway. They were in his mind, manipulating his thoughts, invading his world. Suddenly, it all clicked. The black circuit didn't just want to control the world's electricity. They wanted to control him. They wanted to use his abilities to reshape the world in their image. They had been watching him for weeks, studying his every move. They knew everything about him, his job, his habits, his weaknesses, but Yang Xiang wasn't going to let that happen. He wasn't going to be a pawn in their game. The next day, Yang Xiang returned to work, determined to find a way to turn the tables on the black circuit. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were always watching, always waiting for him to slip up. He spent hours at his desk, pretending to follow the usual routines, while his mind was elsewhere. He was planning his next move. But the message was clear: he had become part of something much larger. The world wasn't just wired with electricity anymore, it was wired with data, with invisible connections that spanned the globe. And in this new world, Yang Xiang had to be careful. Every click, every movement, was a risk. The black circuit was always watching. That night, Yang Xiang stayed late in the plant. The others had left, but he remained, lost in the hum of the machines. He needed to be sure. He needed to confirm that he could control this power, this strange ability that had taken hold of him. He sat down at his desk and closed his eyes. The flicker of the overhead lights seemed to beckon him. Slowly, he reached out, mentally, this time, and let himself sink into the grid. The sensation was immediate. He could feel it, all around him, the pulse of electricity, the movement of data, the flow of power running through the city like lifeblood, and then, he did it. He reached out, past the wires, past the transformers, and into the heart of the global network. For the first time, Yang Xiang could feel himself truly merge with the system, moving through the digital world like a shadow. His heart raced as he realized the full extent of his power. He wasn't just connected to one grid, one city, one plant, he was connected to the entire world's infrastructure. He could control anything. Everything, but in that moment, something dark and dangerous stirred within him. It wasn't just about control. It was about freedom. That he had the power to rewrite the rules. To take down the black circuit. To stop the world from falling under their sway. But it wouldn't be easy. There would be consequences. There always were. Yang Xiang's fingers twitched as he took the first step into the unknown. Yang Xiang sat there, suspended in the grid, his mind moving through it as easily as a swimmer slicing through water. He felt as though his entire being was becoming one with the electric currents that hummed beneath the streets, winding their way across the city, connecting homes, businesses, and every electronic device to each other. The power was intoxicating. It was like an adrenaline rush, only quieter, subtler, a sense of control so complete that it took everything else in his world and made it feel insignificant. But it wasn't the feeling of power that troubled him. It was the realization of how easy it was to lose himself in this digital web. The lines between himself and the machine were blurring, and he couldn't ignore the creeping sensation that he wasn't the only one watching from the shadows. He let out a slow breath and focused, pushing aside the gnawing doubt in his chest. He needed to find answers, and he needed to stop the black circuit before they could do whatever it was they had planned. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the future of the entire system, the entire infrastructure that kept the world running. He drew back from the grid, feeling the pressure of his thoughts as he slowly re-entered the physical world. His fingers trembled slightly, a reminder that his body, despite its new connection to the digital landscape, was still human. The hum of the power plant, the flickering fluorescent lights above him, suddenly felt distant, like the world outside was too small for the thing he had become. A thought crossed his mind, and for a second, he couldn't shake the idea, maybe I could just leave. Just walk away, and forget it all. Go back to a life where I don't have to worry about hackers, about controlling everything. About the black circuit. But he knew it wasn't that simple. Walking away wasn't an option anymore. He couldn't unsee what he had become, couldn't ignore the pull of the currents that now seemed to flow through him. He wasn't just some engineer, he was something else entirely. And if he walked away, the people who had targeted him, the ones who had marked him, would take advantage of that. He had no choice but to keep moving forward. The following days were a blur. Yang Xiang threw himself into his work, but his mind was never fully focused on the circuits and transformers in front of him. Instead, he spent every moment thinking of the black circuit, trying to figure out how to stay one step ahead of them. He began digging into their operations, into the depths of the digital world they controlled. Every time he thought he was getting closer, the shadows seemed to move further away. Just out of reach. One afternoon, his phone buzzed again. He almost didn't want to check it. Every message so far had been a threat, a warning, a reminder that he was in too deep, but this time was different. This time, there was a name attached to the message, Lu Jian. The screen read. The name sent a cold shiver down his spine. Lu Jian was someone Yang Xiang hadn't thought about in years. They had worked together at the power plant, back when Yang Xiang was still fresh out of school, eager to prove himself. Lu Jian had been a mentor of sorts, an older, more experienced engineer who knew the ins and outs of the power grid better than anyone. At first, Yang Xiang had admired him. Lu Jian was brilliant, obsessed with power in ways that bordered on the obsessive. But there had always been something off about him. Something dark beneath the surface, and now Lu Jian's name was showing up in connection with the black circuit. Yang Xiang's stomach churned. What was going on? Why was Lu Jian involved in all this? he opened the message. You don't understand what you've become, Yang. But I can help you. I can show you what's possible. You don't need to fight this. Join me. Together, we can reshape everything. The message was cryptic, but Yang Xiang could hear the underlying threat. He was being pulled into something far beyond his control. He could feel it now, a sinking sensation in the pit of his stomach. Yang Xiang didn't waste any time responding, "What do you want from me?" The response was almost instantaneous, "You have something I need. Something that can give me control over everything. The currents, the grid, the digital world. And you're too valuable to let go." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Lu Jian wasn't just asking for his help, he was demanding it. Yang Xiang felt trapped, his only choices shrinking by the second. "I won't join you," he typed, his hands shaking as the words appeared on the screen. "I won't let you use me." There was a long pause before the reply came, "You're already part of this, Yang. You just don't know it yet." Yang Xiang's blood ran cold. What did that mean? Was it too late to get out? Had Lu Jian already planned for this moment, anticipating his refusal? Before he could think further, a flood of code began to fill the screen, scrolling faster than he could comprehend. His fingers went numb as the room around him seemed to shimmer. The lines of code stretched and twisted, forming shapes and symbols that were impossible to interpret. It felt like a digital storm was swirling around him, pulling him into its center. Yang Xiang's heart raced. He tried to disconnect, to close his laptop, but the device wouldn't respond. The screen remained locked, the message flashing over and over again, "You can't escape." Suddenly, everything went dark, the room was plunged into total darkness, the hum of electricity fading into a quiet void. For a moment, Yang Xiang couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He was caught in the silence, disoriented, his mind spinning as the reality of what had just happened settled in. It was then that he realized the truth. Lu Jian wasn't just trying to control him. He already had. Yang Xiang opened his eyes, and the world around him wasn't the same anymore. The digital storm had consumed him, and he was no longer in his apartment. He was somewhere else, somewhere far beyond the physical world. His thoughts swirled in a vast sea of data, surrounded by endless lines of code. He was inside the grid, deeper than he had ever gone before. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of his new surroundings. It felt like a dream, a nightmare, but it was real. He had become part of the system. He had let himself slip too far, let his curiosity guide him into dangerous territory. A figure appeared in front of him, materializing from the digital void. It was Lu Jian. "Welcome to my world," Lu Jian said, his voice echoing through the vast expanse of data. "I hope you understand now. You don't control the grid. I do." Yang Xiang's fists clenched. This was the moment he had feared. Lu Jian had trapped him here, in this space between reality and the digital ether. But Yang Xiang wasn't finished yet. He still had the power. He could still fight. "You're wrong," Yang Xiang said, his voice shaking but determined. "I am the grid now. And you won't control me." With that, he reached deep within himself, stretching his mind into the digital landscape. He could feel it, the pulse of electricity, the ebb and flow of power. And this time, he wasn't just riding the currents. He was the currents. He was the network that he focused, drawing on every ounce of power he had. The system shuddered beneath him, and he felt the surge of electricity crackle through the air. Lu Jian's figure faltered for a moment, a brief flicker of doubt in his eyes. Yang Xiang pushed harder, forcing his way through the system, taking control. It was a battle for the future of the world. A battle for the power to shape reality itself, and Yang Xiang was ready to win. The digital landscape around Yang Xiang crackled with energy as he fought to maintain control. The system seemed to resist him, pulling and twisting in ways that felt almost sentient. It was like trying to hold onto a live wire, a force that was both electrifying and deadly. But Yang Xiang wasn't afraid anymore. Not of Lu Jian, not of the black circuit. He was no longer just a man trying to fix problems with wires and circuits, he had become something else. He had become the current itself. His mind stretched deeper into the system, past firewalls and encrypted barriers, past the lines of code that separated him from the true heart of the network. He could feel the weight of it, the sheer magnitude of the world's interconnectedness. Every piece of data, every byte of information, was within his reach. And with a single thought, he could bend it to his will. But Lu Jian wasn't going down without a fight. The figure before him flickered again, the digital form of his former mentor twitching in a way that almost seemed human. You can't control everything, Yang. This isn't some game you can win. The system is too big. You're just a cog in the machine. Yang Xiang's heart beat in his ears, but his resolve was unwavering. Lu Jian had always been about control, always about bending others to his will. He was the one who had taught Yang Xiang everything he knew about the grid, but now, the roles had reversed. Now, it was Yang Xiang who was in charge. This is no longer about control, Yang Xiang said, his voice steady. This is about freedom. And you'll never understand that. The digital storm around him intensified, and Yang Xiang could feel the power surge beneath him. Lu Jian's figure wavered again, as if the grid itself were rejecting him, unable to keep up with the pressure Yang Xiang was putting on it. You don't know what you're doing, Lu Jian hissed, the edges of his form flickering like a dying flame. You're a tool. A puppet. The black circuit will come for you, and you won't be able to hide. Yang Xiang's hands clenched into fists. He had heard the name black circuit enough times now to know what it meant: power, secrecy, control. They were the ones who had pulled the strings, the ones who had shaped the digital world to their will. But Yang Xiang wasn't afraid anymore. He didn't need their approval. He didn't need their power. I'm not your puppet anymore, he said, his voice echoing in the empty digital space. And neither are you. With a final, focused push, Yang Xiang reached into the heart of the system. His mind expanded like a shockwave, breaking through barriers, breaking through firewalls, breaking through everything Lu Jian had built. For a split second, he felt the weight of the entire world, the electricity surging through the grid, the whispers of millions of devices, all of them interconnected, all of them alive with the hum of the digital age. And for a moment, everything paused. Then, with a single, overwhelming jolt, Yang Xiang surged forward, driving the power through the system like a hammer striking an anvil. Lu Jian screamed, a sound that echoed through the digital void. But it was too late. The code around him shattered, and the storm of data that had been swirling around them both began to collapse. Lu Jian's form flickered and stuttered, unable to keep up with the overwhelming force of Yang Xiang's will. And then, with a final flash of light, Lu Jian was gone. The digital landscape fell silent. Yang Xiang stood alone, floating in the vast emptiness of the grid. His chest rose and fell with each breath, but his mind was clear, his body still humming with the electric charge that now flowed through him. He had won. He had taken control of the system, but the victory felt hollow. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, Yang Xiang knew the battle wasn't over. The black circuit might have lost its leader, but they were still out there, waiting, watching. And there were other forces in the world, corporations, governments, individuals, who would want to harness the power he now wielded. He looked around at the empty void, the digital landscape stretching infinitely in every direction. There was no going back. He couldn't just step out of the grid and return to his old life. That life no longer existed. He had become something else entirely. With a deep breath, Yang Xiang closed his eyes and let the system flow around him. He could feel it, all of it, the power of the grid, the pulse of electricity, the flow of information. He could shape it, control it, make it his own. And for the first time, he understood the true scope of what he had become. But power like this came with a price. As he moved deeper into the system, his thoughts were interrupted by a faint voice, distant but unmistakable. The words came through like a whisper in the back of his mind, a cold reminder of the path he had chosen. You think you've won? You're just getting started. The voice sent a chill down his spine. It was impossible. He had taken down Lu Jian, shattered the black circuit's control. But the voice, cold and calculating, lingered in his mind. You're never truly in control, it continued, the voice growing louder with each passing second. You've just begun to understand the game. And we've been waiting for someone like you. Yang Xiang's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit him. The black circuit wasn't gone. They were still out there, and they had been watching him the entire time that he wasn't free. Not yet. The power that had once felt like an overwhelming force of freedom now felt like a chain, locking him deeper into a world of digital manipulation and unseen eyes. There was no escaping it now. He had become too entangled in the grid, too connected to the network to ever truly leave. As he continued to navigate the vast system, the truth became clear. He was no longer just part of the electrical network. He was the network itself. A part of something bigger, something that spanned the globe, that connected everything, and that made him a target. Yang Xiang had been right about one thing: the world had changed, and with it, so had he. There was no going back to the life he once knew. The only question now was whether he could control the current, or if the current would control him. He wasn't sure yet, but he was ready to find out.